The morning started with the soft thud of Clara Mae's bare feet on plank floor, the creak of a door that had learned every sorrow she owned, and the rustle of hens waking under a sky the color of old tin. She wrapped her shawl over her nightdress and stepped into the yard. The air smelled like dust and rosemary. A breeze turned her hair wild. She fed the chickens with a tin scoop, scattering cracked corn, clucking back at them as if the birds and she had a secret language. They answered with the frank appetite of creatures that never lied. The cabin had been her parents', 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen stitched to the side, with a porch that tilted as if always listening toward town. Her mother's copper pot still hung by the stove. The walls kept their stories the way trees keep rings. Clara set water to boil, kneaded dough, and pressed her thumbs into the pale belly of a biscuit until it rose like a promise. The oven took the pan with a sigh. She hummed the hymn her father used to mumble while he whittled. Same 3 notes, a tune that didn't try to be grand. Steam fogged the window. Her reflection in the pane looked back at her, the soft round of her cheeks, the loose braid, the shoulders broader than any dressmaker in Dust Creek had patience for. She looked, then looked away, not unkindly, but the way you look at a truth you can't lift yet. By the time the biscuits were stacked on a cloth and the stew pot was set on the back of the stove to simmer for evening, the sun had climbed to a white coin and the dirt road to town was throwing up heat you could see. She loaded the wagon with eggs, a jar of blackberry preserves, and 2 loaves wrapped in paper. Flour was running low. Salt, too, and the preacher's wife had asked for a pan of biscuits for Sunday. Clara tied the reins, checked the wheel pins, and clucked to the old mare. Dust Creek wore its plainness without shame. A boxy church painted the color of bone, a blacksmith whose laugh could lift a mule, a single cottonwood at the well, and the general store that pretended it was important because it sold both nails and licorice. As she drove, she planned the week like she always did. Wash on Monday, mend on Tuesday, bake on Wednesday, plans that filled the hours like stones in a jar. She told herself it was enough. On good days, she almost believed it. She pulled up by the well, hopped down, and the wagon springs sighed their relief. Heat pinned her hair to her neck. Children ran past in a swarm, mouths stained with candy, and one boy whispered to a girl, loud enough to carry, "There goes Miss Breadbelly." The girl giggled, then smothered it with her hand when she saw Clara's eyes flicker. Clara pretended not to hear. She always pretended. She tied the mare to the post and straightened her shawl as if order could be buttoned on. Inside the general store, the bell over the door rang a thin silver sound. Shelves stood obedient with sacks and jars. Mrs. Beatrice Clay, who kept her hair in a tight coil and her judgments looser, looked up from her ledger. "Morning, Miss Hensley," she sang, a voice with sugar at the tip and vinegar underneath. "You're out early." "Flour," Clara said, calm as she could, setting eggs on the counter. "And salt. If you've any cinnamon left, I'd take a pinch." "Cinnamon costs," Mrs. Clay answered. "It's a luxury. What with the railroad taking its sweet time and the freight boys gambling more than hauling." "I know." Clara set a jar of preserves beside the eggs. "I brought blackberries. And bread." Mrs. Clay lifted the cloth on the loaf. The smell rose, warm and honest, and for a moment the other woman's face softened. She cut her glance toward the window as if checking who might be watching that softness, then sniffed. "We can trade," she said, ink pen already scratching. "But mind you, be careful with luxuries. They go to the waste." Clara felt the little wince under her ribs and let it pass. "Yes, ma'am." A pair of women across the aisle bent their heads together like crows. A whisper tugged at the air. Rancher, widow, old soldier, and then a name, Mr. Grant. Clara didn't look up. Folks said a lot of things about Elias Grant. That he spoke less than a stone, that he ate at his kitchen table like a man listening for footsteps that never came. Some said he'd been a soldier out east, and the war had taken the color from him. Others said it was his wife's grave up on the ridge that did the bleaching. He came into town once a month for coffee and fence wire and left without leaving so much as a footprint in conversation. Clara paid with bread and jam and the lightest coins she had left. When she carried her sack toward the door, Mrs. Clay's voice came gentle and bright as a hook. "You be sure not to overdo it with that cinnamon, Miss Hensley," she said. "A man'll like a sweet biscuit now and then, but a woman must mind her proportions if she aims to be chosen." Clara stopped with her hand on the door, the bell's tongue cold under her palm. "I aim to bake good bread," she said, not turning. "That's enough for me." The bell rang again. Air changed like the room had exhaled. Outside, she let the sound of the wind clean her ears. Back at the well, she gave the mare water, then glanced toward the church. A bucket of wild sunflowers leaned against the steps, heads bright as if sunlight had gone to seed. She thought about taking one, then left them be. It felt wrong to steal a brightness not meant for you. She ate her midday bread alone at the back of her wagon, looking at the town as if it were a painting hung too high. A fly worried her sleeve. The world went on. She folded paper around the extra biscuit and tucked it at the bottom of her sack. Later, she promised herself she'd have that with stew and a story she'd read 3 times already. Then she laughed at her own stubbornness, at the way she tried to call habits by nobler names. By the time she turned home, the sun had hardened, glare off the stones like a dare. The road curved along low hills, tufted with rabbit brush and sage. Heat made the distance quiver. The old mare chose her own pace. Clara's brain loosened in the sway. A list of chores, the sound of her mother's voice correcting her need, the shape of loneliness that sat quiet in her chest like a cat in a window. The wagon rattled over a rut, and then a sound cracked the afternoon, a sharp splintering like a bone losing patience. The wheel stuttered, lurched, and the wagon pitched. Clara grabbed the bench. Breath punched out of her as the wagon slumped to one side and froze. The mare snorted, offended. Dust lifted and settled. Clara climbed down, skirt catching on the axle. The front right wheel leaned drunkenly. A spoke snapped clean through. She put her shoulder to the rim, tested the lift, and felt it laugh at her. She pushed again. The wood bit her palm. Heat in her face, sweat at her neck. The sudden ridiculous stinging urge to cry. She looked up the road. Empty all the way to the horizon's bare lip. On the hill ahead, a fence line ran like a straight sentence. Beyond it, far off, a ranch house crouched low against the wind, with a corral and a cottonwood, and the color of roofs that have weathered every season without complaint. A man moved by the corral, small in the distance, the tilt of a hat you could recognize from a prayer. Clara shaded her eyes. The mare flicked her tail, unimpressed with the crisis. She'd never walked onto another person's land uninvited. But the wagon wasn't moving by itself. Pride was heavy, but heavier still was a sack of flour, baking in the sun, and the stretch of road that would empty the day of mercy if she waited. Clara tied the reins short, patted the mare's velvet nose, and set off up the slope. Grass scratched her ankles. Grasshoppers leapt like tossed coins. When she reached the fence, she stood a moment to catch breath and to decide if she would call out or turn back. She didn't have enough breath for both. The man by the corral straightened, looked over, and then he was coming, unhurried, but with that inexorable pace of a person who knows his ground like the back of his hand. Closer, his presence was a kind of quiet. Broad shoulders under a faded shirt, hat brim throwing his eyes into shade, a mouth set by habit rather than meanness. His hands were large in a way that made a hammer seem like a small thing. He stopped a polite distance from the fence. "Afternoon," he said, voice low and gravelly, as if he'd been saving words and decided to spend one. "Afternoon," Clara answered. She could hear her own breath. It sounded like a bellows. "Sir, my wheel." The spoke gave up 2 miles back. I can't budge it." She heard how ridiculous that sounded. A woman announcing a fact obvious as the sun. Her cheeks burned. Honesty reached for her tongue, as it always did when her nerves caught fire. "I'm too heavy for grace, sir," she blurted, "but I can cook if you'll lend a hand." He didn't laugh. Something in his face changed, a small surprise softening, like a door easing on its hinges. He tipped his hat. "Elias Grant," he said. "That's your wagon by the bend?" "Yes." She held the fence post as if it would keep her from floating off in mortification. Clara Mae Hensley. "Well, Miss Hensley," he said, "let's fetch that wagon before the sun decides to peel the road." They walked back down the slope without speaking. The quiet between them wasn't unfriendly. It was the quiet of two people who understand that words are tools and not decoration. At the wagon, Elias knelt by the wheel, thumbed the broken spoke, and nodded to himself. "We can brace it. I've a spare spoke and a jack." He looked at the sacks in the back. "You hauling flour?" "Yes, sir," she almost said, "and cinnamon." Then swallowed the silliness. "And I can make you supper, in trade." She felt foolish and stubborn at once, the way a child feels walking with a bookseller into Sunday. His eyes flicked toward her, the first real look, brown, and more tired than cold. "You don't have to cook," he said. "I know," she said, "but I'd like to. It's what I have." He considered that. Then he unlatched the mule from the corral rail he'd led behind him, fetched a jack and length of spoke from a shed, and set to work. He moved without haste and without waste. He had the wheel up and braced in less time than it took Clara to run her sleeve over her forehead and repin a strand of hair. He didn't ask her to lift anything, didn't comment on what she could or couldn't do. He said, "Hold that," and she held. He said, "Hand me that," and she handed. The sun slid a finger from one shadow to another. When the wheel was sound again, he stood, wiped his hands on a rag, and glanced toward the ranch house. "Kitchen's clean," he said, almost apologetic. "Was my wife's." He looked like a man stepping out on thin ice just naming her. "You're welcome to make supper there, if you still mean to." "I do," Clara said. "Thank you." They drove the wagon up the slope together, Elias leading his mule, Clara on the bench with the mare. The ranch came into clearer view. The cottonwood with its wide, forgiving shade, a pump by the back door, the porch with a rocking chair that looked too new to be truly used. The house itself had been built by hands that measured twice and cut once. It was not a grand place, but it had the gravity of structures that had earned their place by refusing to fall. Inside, the kitchen held stillness like a bowl holds water. A row of blue-glazed plates on a shelf, a copper kettle polished thin, a lace curtain that had trapped a triangle of sunlight and turned it gentle. Clara stood a moment, hat in her hands, feeling like a trespasser in a museum of someone else's tenderness. Then the familiar practical rhythm returned. Wash hands, tie apron, set water, check the pantry. She found beans, onions, a strip of salt pork, and a small jar of coffee. In a tin at the back, wrapped in paper, the kind of thrift only widowers manage, she found a heel of cornmeal. "May I?" she called. "Use what you need," Elias answered from the yard, where he was coiling a rope and listening to the horse breathe. Clara put the pork in the pot and the onions after, let the smell rise like a hymn. Beans followed, water, salt. A bay leaf she'd tucked in her pocket from her own cupboard, out of habit. She set the kettle to boil, scooped coffee, and thought, on a reckless impulse, of the paper twist of cinnamon in her sack. She took the smallest pinch and let it fall like a secret into the pot. For the bread, she fashioned a quick skillet of corn cakes, crisp edges, a promise of the right kind of hunger. When Elias came in, he stood in the doorway, as if granting the room a chance to adjust to him. He took off his hat. Dust lay in the brim like memory. He watched her work, not in the way of a man judging, but like a person standing in rain after a drought, quietly grateful, unwilling to speak for fear of scaring the clouds away. She tried not to mind that feeling. It had been a long time since she had cooked for anyone but herself. Her hands remembered on their own. They ate at a small pine table, scarred by years of plates and elbows. She served him first without thinking, then caught herself, embarrassed, and filled her own bowl. Steam ghosted up, made their faces shine. He took a spoonful, then another, and then he made a sound, not quite a word. He set the spoon down lightly, as if the stew were something alive he didn't want to startle. "Haven't tasted home in a long while," he said. Clara looked at her hands. "I'm glad you like it." He nodded, as if that name, like, were too light for what he meant. They ate mostly in silence, the small talk of weather unnecessary with the smell of rain waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. He asked, finally, "You live alone?" "Yes." She tried to make it sound like a choice, not a verdict. Chickens keep me busy. The stove, too. Long way for supplies, he said. Not so long if a wheel holds. He smiled. It changed his face more than she expected, as if a window had opened. They finished, and she rose to wash the bowls. He reached to take them, and their fingers knocked, both of them pulling back like children caught stealing sugar. She laughed, then put a hand to her mouth, surprised by the sound. He laughed once, too, low and brief, like a man relearning how. After, she wrapped 2 corn cakes in a cloth and tucked them into his bread tin for morning. She cleaned the skillet, wiped the table, straightened the curtain that didn't need straightening. There was nothing left to fix but the emptiness that would return when she left. She walked with him to the porch. The day had tilted toward evening, that hour when the light makes even poor land look like something promised. The cottonwood leaves murmured. A hawk drew a line across the sky and disappeared into distance. Elias stood with his hands in his pockets, not quite at ease, not quite uncomfortable. He looked at the yard as if to spare her the weight of his gratitude. "Thank you," he said finally. He looked at her then, properly. "For the stew. For the room doesn't feel so loud when someone else is in it." She understood that loudness, that way a quiet house can shout. "It was nothing," she said, meaning it was everything. "And thank you for the wheel." He tipped his hat again, formal in a way that made her feel honored rather than dismissed. "If it troubles again, send word down the fence. I'm out here most days." "I'll manage," she said then, softer, honest without apology. "But I won't say no." She climbed onto the wagon bench, gathered the reins, and clicked her tongue. The mare stepped forward. The wheels rolled, sound truer now. She glanced back once. Elias stood on the porch, one hand on the post, watching as if watching were a kind of working. The sky took the sun and turned it to copper. For a long mile she felt the shape of him lingering behind her like a warmth a stove keeps even after the fire goes out. She reached the road where her wheel had failed and felt the wagon glide past the memory of trouble sure-footed, as if the land itself had decided to be kind. She breathed in, slow and deep. The cinnamon made a ghost of sweetness in her throat. She turned, in her mind, the sentence she'd said without thinking, "Too heavy for grace," and felt the foolish ache of it. The mare's ears flicked back, catching some tune Clara didn't know she was humming. The light thinned. At her cabin, shadows gathered early under the eaves. She unharnessed the mare, brushed her down, then carried the sack inside. The room opened its familiar emptiness like a book to the same page. She set water on the stove, lit the lamp, and took a cup to the porch. Crickets began their violin. In town, Mrs. Clay was putting coins in a jar. Out by the ridge, a man she barely knew was finishing the dishes she had washed clean, drying the last bowl with a towel that still remembered his wife's hands. Clara took a sip of water and closed her eyes. The day sat in her like a warm stone. She wasn't foolish enough to turn one meal into a story, but something had shifted. The way a table leg shifts under a plate, making you reach to steady it and realize you are not the only steady thing in a room. She pressed her palms together and let the quiet move through her. Far off, a whippoorwill called twice. She answered by listening. And on the porch of a ranch house on the hill, Elias Grant watched the road where the wagon had vanished. The sunset lay across the land like a shawl. He had not asked for the day to bring him anything. It had brought him anyway. He stood there long after the light let go, feeling, against his will and to his astonishment, something he had not felt in years, something small and alive, the first flicker after a long dark. He looked at the empty chair beside him, then at the door. He did not speak it aloud. The night was tender with its own thoughts. He did not move until the stars had taken their positions, each one a nail holding the black up where it belonged. Only then did he go inside. The smell of stew still in the air like a promise kept. The next morning came slow and golden over Dust Creek. The sun reached through Clara's curtains like a guest too polite to knock. She was already awake, sitting at the edge of her bed with her hair half braided, hands idle in her lap. The warmth on her face should have felt kind, but her thoughts were tangled like the ends of that braid. She could still see Elias Grant standing on that porch, still hear the deep weight in his voice when he said thank you. It wasn't the words that kept echoing. It was the way they had sounded, as though they'd been buried in dust for years and were only now finding air again. She finished braiding her hair, tied it with the red ribbon her mother had once used, and went to the kitchen. The stew pot still held its scent from yesterday. She smiled faintly, though she tried not to. The chickens were restless outside, clucking in their morning gossip. She stepped out, scattering feed, and the birds rushed forward, greedy as always. The world carried on as though nothing had changed, yet something had. She could feel it in her stomach, in her fingertips, in the quiet hum she caught herself making when she thought of his porch, his stillness, the sound of his spoon in the bowl. By mid-morning, the road to town shimmered with heat. Clara hitched the mare again, a smaller basket of bread in the wagon bed. She told herself she was going to town only to deliver a loaf to the church kitchen. But when she reached the fork where one road bent toward town and the other curved toward the Grant Ranch, her hands hesitated on the reins. The mare flicked her ears as if waiting for Clara's truth to catch up with her. She turned the wagon left, toward the hills. When the ranch house came into view, Elias was out by the barn, mending a fence rail with a hammer and quiet patience. He looked up at the sound of the wheels, wiping his hands on his trousers. His eyes caught the morning light. He didn't look surprised exactly, more like someone who'd been expecting a sound he didn't dare name. Clara climbed down, holding the basket like an apology. "I brought bread," she said, "and some apple butter. Thought you might could use it." He nodded, took the basket carefully, as though it held something fragile. "You didn't have to ride out." "I know," she said softly, "but I wanted to. Yesterday, you helped me. Least I could do is bring breakfast." Elias hesitated, then motioned toward the porch. "There's coffee on the stove." Was about to pour a cup. The kitchen looked different in morning light. Dust motes danced where shadows had slept the day before. Clara set out the bread, spreading the apple butter thick on 2 slices. Elias poured coffee into tin cups. When their fingers brushed as he handed her one, she almost dropped it from the jolt that moved through her. They ate in the kind of silence that meant more than chatter. Outside, the horses stamped and blew in the corral. A hawk circled high above the ridge. Clara chewed slowly, aware of the warmth in her cheeks, aware of how small the room suddenly felt. Elias set his cup down. "Been a long time since anyone cooked here," he said. "House feels less hollow when it smells like bread." "Then I'll make sure it don't stay hollow," Clara said before thinking. She blushed, fumbling for a recovery. "I mean, I could bring food by now and then. I cook more than I can eat." He nodded. Wouldn't mind that. They shared a glance. Quick, shy, but enough. Something gentle had begun between them, like a spark under ash, not yet a flame, but alive. As the morning stretched, Elias offered to show her the barn. She followed him through the yard, the hem of her skirt brushing the grass. The barn smelled of hay, leather, and the soft musk of horses. Light fell through the slats, striping his shoulders in gold. He spoke little, but the way he moved, steady, measured, told her what kind of man he was. No boasting, no hurry. He did everything like he intended to do it right the first time. He showed her a calf born 2 nights ago, still wobbly on its legs. She knelt beside the pen, smiling as the calf sniffed her fingers. "He's beautiful," she said. "Mean little thing," Elias replied, smiling faintly. "Tried to bite me this morning." Clara laughed, and the sound startled them both. Elias looked at her, eyes softening, and for a heartbeat they forgot the calf, the barn, the heat outside. Only the air between them mattered. She rose, brushing straw from her skirt. "Well, I'd best get back before the mare decides I've joined your herd." "I'll walk you to the wagon," he said. At the gate, she turned to him, wanting to say something kind, but not knowing what shape it should take. The words that came out were simple. "You've got a good place here, Elias. Feels like home." He looked toward the house, toward the empty window where curtains swayed. "It used to," he said. "Maybe it will again." Their eyes met. A promise unspoken hung there. carried by the warm wind. Then she climbed up, and he stepped back as the wheels rolled away. He watched until the wagon disappeared down the slope. That night, Clara sat at her kitchen table long after supper. The oil lamp flickered. Her bread cooled untouched. She'd never felt such a strange mix of calm and trembling. The thought of him, his quiet, his steadiness, kept her company in the silence. She told herself she wasn't falling for him, only grateful for kindness. But the lie didn't last long. Days passed, and the rhythm of visits grew naturally, like the tide. Clara found excuses to pass near the ranch, a basket of eggs to trade, a pot of stew to share, a loaf to drop off. Sometimes Elias met her by the fence. Other times she found him splitting wood or checking cattle. Each visit lasted a little longer than the one before. One afternoon, he caught her by surprise. As she handed him a jar of preserved peaches, he said, "You should stay for supper. I'll cook this time." She blinked. "You cook?" "Beans, mostly. Sometimes bacon. Sometimes I burn both." She smiled. "Then I'll risk it." That evening, the sky turned amber and blue as they sat on his porch with tin plates balanced on their knees. The beans were indeed slightly burned, but Clara said nothing. The silence between them was full, not empty. She told him about her father's old fiddle, broken and hung above the hearth. He told her about his wife, how she'd loved wildflowers and laughter. There was no bitterness in his tone, only memory softened by time. When he finished, she said quietly, "You must have loved her deeply." He nodded. "I did. Still do, in some way." He looked at her then, eyes honest and searching. But life keeps going. The heart finds new ground, even when it's scared to plant again. Her breath caught. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at the horizon, where the last light bled away. The first stars trembled above the plains. Elias leaned back in his chair, hat in his lap. "Dust Creek's got its share of gossip," he said after a while. "They'll have things to say about you riding out here so often." "I know," Clara said. "They always have something to say. Might as well give them a story worth telling." He chuckled quietly. "You don't scare easy." "I've been scared all my life," she said. "But fear don't stop the day from coming, does it?" He looked at her with something like admiration. The porch light caught her hair, turning it copper. A breeze lifted the ends of her shawl. He wanted to tell her she looked beautiful, not despite her size, not in defiance of it, but because she carried herself like someone who'd learned to endure. Instead, he said softly, "You're stronger than most folks I've met." She smiled at her hands. "Strong don't always mean brave." "Maybe not," he said. "But you've got both, I think." They sat there until the night was full, until the crickets replaced their words. When she finally rose to leave, Elias walked her to the gate again. The stars stretched endless above them. He took her reins, steadying the mare as she climbed up. His hand brushed her boot. That touch lingered. "Good night, Clara Mae," he said. "Good night, Elias." As she rode off, she felt a heat in her chest that wasn't the air. Her name on his tongue had sounded like something sacred. In town, tongues wagged as they always did. Mrs. Clay noted that Clara's cheeks had taken on a glow from baking in the sun too much. The blacksmith's wife whispered that Elias Grant was finally smiling again. Clara pretended not to hear any of it. Yet when she passed a mirror at the general store and caught her reflection, she noticed she was indeed smiling more. One evening, as she walked past the church, she found the preacher's daughter crying on the steps over a broken doll. Clara knelt, mended the arm with a bit of twine from her pocket, and comforted the child. The little girl wiped her tears and said, "You're the lady who makes Mr. Grant happy." Clara froze, then laughed softly. "Maybe I just make good stew." The girl shook her head. "Mama says he laughs when you visit." Clara had no answer for that, but the words followed her all the way home. That night, rain came sudden and hard. Thunder rolled over the hills. Clara stood by her window, watching the lightning fork above the ridge where Elias lived. She worried for him, though she knew he was capable. Still, she whispered a prayer for his safety before blowing out the lamp. Far across the valley, Elias sat by his hearth, the storm flickering against the walls. On the table lay the small cloth she'd left behind by accident, a folded napkin, embroidered with a red flower. He turned it in his hands like a relic. It smelled faintly of cinnamon and smoke. He didn't know why it felt important, only that it did. As dawn broke over the soaked land, both of them were thinking of the other. Clara rose early to check her garden, muddy and fragrant after the storm. She gathered herbs, humming. Elias saddled his horse and rode down to the river to see if the bridge had held. The air was cool and washed clean, the kind of morning that made a man think maybe the world still held second chances. When Clara's wagon creaked up his drive later that afternoon, she didn't need to explain why she'd come. He didn't ask. She simply handed him a loaf wrapped in cloth, and he said, "You're just in time for coffee." The sky stretched wide and endless above them, and the scent of fresh rain clung to everything. They stood on the porch, two souls who had spent too long alone, sharing a silence that didn't ache anymore. The land around them breathed, the way the heart does when it begins to trust again. Neither said it yet, but both knew. Something had started. Quiet as sunrise, steady as bread rising in a warm oven. And once begun, it would not stop. Dust Creek had always carried whispers. They rolled off the dry hills like tumbleweeds, harmless at first, until they gathered and grew spines. Clara Mae knew that, but she hadn't expected to be at the center of them. At first, it was small things. A woman lingering too long at the church door when Clara walked past. A few glances shared across the mercantile counter. Then one morning she went to buy sugar, and Mrs. Beatrice Clay's voice was soft as satin, but cold as a knife's back. "So, Mrs. Clay said, folding a piece of cloth with deliberate slowness, "how fares the rancher these days? I hear you've been keeping his kitchen busy." Clara paused, basket on her arm. "I bring him food now and then," she said carefully. "He works hard, doesn't have anyone to cook for him." "That's mighty generous," Mrs. Clay replied, eyes glinting. "Most women wouldn't ride that far out for a man who isn't courting them." The two women across the store smothered smiles. Clara's throat went dry. She wanted to tell them it wasn't like that she was just helping, but the words tangled. Anything she said would feed them more. She paid for the sugar and left without another word. Outside, the air felt heavier. Dust rose in the street, and the sunlight had turned mean. She didn't go to the ranch that day, nor the next. Elias noticed. 3 days passed, then 4. The 5th morning, he rode into town for nails, though his bins were full. He stopped by the well, hat low, eyes searching. He didn't see her. People greeted him out of habit, some with curiosity. He was used to being alone, but now the quiet had an edge to it. When he finally saw her again, it was by accident. She was standing behind the church, hanging washed linens on the line. The wind lifted her skirt slightly and tangled a strand of hair against her cheek. For a moment, he just watched, the rhythm of her hands, the small, determined crease in her brow. Then he said her name softly. "Clara Mae." She turned, startled, then forced a smile. "Elias, you're in town." "I was looking for you." Her hands froze on the clothespin. "You shouldn't have." "Why not?" She looked away, toward the mountains. "People talk." He waited, letting the space between them breathe. "Let them," he said. She shook her head. "It's easy for you to say. You're a man. They don't weigh you with words." He took a step closer, his boots crunching on gravel. "They can talk until the sky falls. It won't change what's true." Clara gave a small, sad laugh. "What's true, Elias?" He didn't answer. He wanted to say everything. That she brought light back to a house that had forgotten warmth, that her laughter had made the silence bearable, that he thought of her more than was proper. But he couldn't give those words shape yet. Instead, he said, "You've been missed." She bit her lip, fighting the sting in her eyes. "I don't belong in stories like that," she whispered. "Not in yours." He reached out as if to touch her arm, then stopped. "Clara." But she was already gathering the last sheet, pretending she hadn't heard. The air between them thickened, full of things neither could say. That night, Clara sat at her kitchen table, the lamp burning low. The sugar from the store sat unopened. She could still hear Mrs. Clay's voice, and the laughter that followed it. She told herself it didn't matter, but shame crawled under her skin like an itch she couldn't reach. She remembered Elias's eyes, steady, kind, too honest, and that only made it worse. The next morning she baked, though she had no appetite. Her biscuits came out perfect, golden as always, but she couldn't bring herself to eat them. She packed them in a basket and told herself she'd take them to the preacher's wife. Instead, when she reached the fork in the road, she stopped again. Her mare pawed at the dust, waiting for her decision. She turned toward the ranch. When she arrived, Elias was by the barn, oiling his saddle. He looked up, surprise breaking across his face before he managed to hide it. "Morning," she said quietly, stepping down. "Brought biscuits." He set the rag aside, nodding. "You didn't have to." "I know." She hesitated. "May I come in?" He motioned toward the porch. "Of course." Inside, the house was just as she remembered. The faint smell of wood smoke and coffee, the way light slipped through the curtains. She set the basket down and clasped her hands. "I owe you an apology," she said finally, "for avoiding you. You don't owe me anything." "Yes, I do." Her voice trembled. "It's not you, Elias. It's me. Folks have been talking, saying I'm chasing you, saying I'm desperate." He frowned. "That's nonsense." "Maybe," she said. "But they say it all the same, and they're not wrong about me being desperate. I've been lonely so long, sometimes I forget how to behave around kindness." He stepped closer, slow and careful, as though she might bolt. "Clara Mae, there's nothing wrong with wanting company." Her throat tightened. "There's wanting, and there's foolishness. A woman like me doesn't get looked at twice. Not by men like you." "Men like me?" "Tall, respectable, quiet. Still mourning, maybe, but better than me." He took off his hat, running a hand through his hair. "Clara, listen to me. You're not less than anyone." She shook her head. "You don't see it because you're kind. But I hear it every time I walk through town. Every time a mirror catches me by surprise." Her voice cracked. "I'm too fat to love, Elias, too heavy for grace, too much woman for any man to want." The silence that followed was deep as a well. Then Elias set his hat on the table, crossed the room in 2 strides, and stopped right in front of her. His face was unreadable, but his voice came rough, thick with feeling. "You think love's measured by what folks see? You think I care about how a dress fits or what gossip fills a parlor? You've been feeding my soul, Clara Mae. I ain't felt alive in years till you came around." She looked up at him, tears standing in her eyes. "Don't say that if you don't mean it. I mean every damn word." Her breath caught. She wanted to believe him so badly that it hurt, but fear still held her. "Then why?" she began, but a sudden knock at the door cut her short. It was one of Elias's ranch hands, a boy barely 20, hat dripping with sweat. "Mr. Grant," he said, breathless. "River's rising fast up north. If it don't let up, it'll flood the lower pastures." Elias's jaw tightened. "How bad?" "Bad enough we'll need sandbags before nightfall." He nodded, then looked back at Clara. "I have to go." "Go," she said, voice shaking. "Do what you must." He wanted to say something more, to reach for her again, but duty pulled him away. He grabbed his gloves, his rope, and followed the boy out the door. The hoofbeats faded down the hill. Clara stood there a long while, listening to the empty house breathe. The smell of biscuits and coffee lingered, sweet and heavy. She set her hand on the table where his hat had rested moments ago. Her tears fell soundless, one by one. Outside, clouds gathered low over the ridge. The air felt heavy with promise and warning. The flood that would soon come was already whispering through the dry gullies. That night, rain began to fall over Dust Creek. Slow at first, then harder, until it beat the roof like fists. Water pooled under Clara's porch, and the wind bent the trees. She lit a lamp, staring at the flames trembling dance. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. Elias didn't sleep. He worked through the night with his men, hauling sand, driving posts, shouting over the storm. His thoughts kept drifting to her cabin downriver, to the light he imagined still burning in her window. Near midnight, he climbed the ridge and looked toward her land. The river glimmered pale and angry below. His stomach knotted. If the rain kept up, it would reach her house by morning. He mounted his horse, drenched and tired, and turned toward the trail that led to her. The rain did not stop. It fell through the night like the sky had broken open and forgotten how to close. Wind tore across the plains, bending trees and driving the water sideways. The air tasted of mud and thunder. Down in the valley, the river that had slept quiet all summer began to roar, swelling over its banks, carrying branches, logs, and the bones of fences. Clara Mae sat by the window, wrapped in her shawl, watching the storm crawl closer. The lamp flickered. Each flash of lightning showed the world for a heartbeat. Her yard, the hen house, the rising edge of the river glinting silver through the dark. It was already too close. She thought of Elias, thought of his voice when he said he had to go the way the rain had followed him out the door. She tried to tell herself he was safe, that he'd done this before, that he was strong enough to face anything. But the wind howled like something alive, and the creek outside sounded like it was growing teeth. When the water reached her porch, she knew she had to move. She packed a few things, her mother's Bible, a loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, and put them in a sack. The chickens screamed in their coop, wings beating the dark. She ran outside, skirts clinging heavy to her legs, hair plastered to her face. Rain stung her eyes. She untied the coop door and opened it wide. "Go!" she shouted, though her voice was lost in the storm. The hens burst out, scattering into the black. The water was at her ankles now. She turned toward the barn, thinking she might hitch the mare and ride for the ridge, but when she opened the barn door, the mare was panicked, eyes rolling white, hooves pounding the mud. Clara tried to calm her, whispering, stroking her neck, but lightning split the sky above them and the animal jerked, rearing. Clara stumbled back, fell in the mud, and the door slammed shut on its own weight. She stood there in the rain, soaked and trembling. The river had reached the steps now, tugging at the first plank. Across the dark field, far off against the curtain of rain, a flicker of light appeared, then another, a lantern, then the shadow of a horse. Elias. He was soaked through, hat gone, rain streaming down his face as he rode hard through the flood. "Clara!" he shouted, though the wind swallowed most of it. He saw her silhouette by the porch and urged the horse forward, splashing through the brown water that now reached the stirrups. "Elias!" she cried, running toward him. The current pulled at her legs, almost taking her down. He jumped off the horse before it had even stopped moving, caught her by the arm, steadying her. "Can't stay here," he yelled. "River's coming fast." "I tried to save the mare." "Forget the mare. We have to go." She hesitated, looking back at the house. The lamplight glowed faintly in the window, a ghostly square of home. "My mother's Bible." He gripped her shoulders, rain streaming from his brow. "Clara Mae, you can't save everything." Thunder shook the ground beneath them. The water rose higher, swirling around their knees now. He pulled her close, holding her steady. "Come on!" They waded toward his horse, but the current was stronger than either of them expected. Each step felt like fighting a living thing. The mud sucked at their boots. The wind pushed them sideways. Clara slipped once, twice. Elias caught her both times, his arms firm around her waist. She gasped, breath coming in bursts. "Hold on to me," he shouted. "I am." The horse fought the flood, trembling, eyes wild. Elias swung up first, then hauled Clara onto the saddle in front of him. "Hold tight," he said, wrapping one arm around her. She clutched his coat, heart pounding against her ribs. He turned the horse toward higher ground. The animal lunged through the water, hooves splashing, every movement a battle. The river surged behind them, tearing pieces of the fence away. Clara looked back once and saw her cabin lift, shudder, and break apart. The roof tilted and vanished into the dark current. She made a small sound, half gasp, half sob, and buried her face against Elias's chest. He felt it. "Don't look back," he said hoarsely. "We'll build again, I promise." The climb to the ridge felt endless. The wind clawed at them, but Elias held her steady, guiding the horse up the slippery slope. His breath came hard, his muscles straining with every motion. Once, a branch whipped across his shoulder, leaving a red mark that bled into the rain. He didn't stop. When they finally reached the ridge, the world fell away beneath them. The valley below was a churning sea. Where her home had stood, only water moved, dark, endless, hungry. Clara stared, her body shaking from cold and shock. "It's gone," she whispered. "Everything." Elias slid off the horse, lifting her down carefully. She stumbled, and he caught her again, steadying her against him. "You're alive," he said. "That's what matters." She looked up at him, eyes wide with grief. "Why did you come for me?" He blinked water from his lashes, voice raw. "Because you're all I've got left that matters." Lightning lit his face, mud-streaked, soaked, fierce. For a moment, everything else fell away. The storm, the noise, the world. She saw only him. He pulled her close, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. They stood beneath a twisted oak, the horse trembling beside them, rain slashing down. Clara's breath came in small, uneven sobs. "I tried to be strong," she whispered, "but I've lost so much already." "You haven't lost me," he said. She looked at him, the words almost lost in the storm. "You mean that?" "I rode through hell to find you. I'd do it again." Her tears mixed with rain. He brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, his rough fingers trembling. Then, slowly, he leaned in and kissed her. Softly at first, like a question, then deeper, like an answer that had been waiting too long. The wind howled around them, but it couldn't touch that moment. When they finally pulled apart, he pressed his forehead to hers. "You're not too much of anything, Clara. You're exactly enough." She closed her eyes, letting the words sink into her like warmth. "I thought love wasn't meant for me." "It was," he said. "It just took the long way around." They found shelter in a small hunter's cabin on the far side of the ridge. It wasn't much, just 4 walls, a stove and a cot, but it was dry. Elias built a fire while Clara sat wrapped in his coat, watching him through the flicker of flames. His hands shook from cold, but he moved with care, setting each log like it mattered. When the fire caught, the orange light painted his face in soft gold. She couldn't stop looking at him. He glanced up, meeting her eyes. "You're shivering." "I'll be fine." He frowned, came closer, and took her hands between his own. They were icy, her fingers stiff and red. He rubbed them gently, bringing them to his lips, breathing warmth into her skin. "Don't be brave now," he said. "Just stay warm." She smiled faintly. "You sound like my father used to." "I'd rather sound like the man who's staying right here." Something in her chest eased. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm raged on. But in that small room, there was a stillness that felt almost holy. When the worst of it passed, Elias hung their wet clothes by the fire and wrapped a blanket around them both. They sat side by side on the floor, the sound of rain softening above them. For a while, neither spoke. There was nothing left to say that the silence didn't already hold. Then Clara whispered, "You shouldn't have come for me. It was dangerous." He looked at her, eyes steady. "If I hadn't, I'd have nothing left to live for." Her breath caught again. "Don't say that." "It's true. You're the only thing that makes this land feel like home again." She turned to him, the firelight catching the tears on her cheeks. "I don't know what I've done to deserve you." He smiled softly. "You baked bread. That's how it started." That made her laugh, a real laugh, even through tears. It filled the small cabin warm and alive, and Elias laughed too, low and rough. When the laughter faded, their hands were still clasped. The night stretched long, but neither felt the weight of it. Outside, the river began to recede. The storm had spent itself. Inside, 2 souls who had lived too long in quiet finally found a sound that felt like belonging, the slow, steady rhythm of shared breathing. By dawn, the clouds had broken. The land was silver with dew, washed clean. Elias opened the door, letting the early light spill in. Steam rose from the wet earth. Clara stepped beside him. barefoot, hair loose from its braid. She leaned against him, eyes soft. "Your house is gone," he said quietly, "but we'll rebuild. You'll come stay at the ranch till we do." She looked up at him. "You mean that?" "I mean to have you where I can see you safe. Every day." She nodded, then turned her face toward the horizon. The sky was clear now, vast and blue as forgiveness. The first sunlight touched the flooded valley, turning the water gold. It looked almost beautiful. Elias slipped his arm around her shoulders. She didn't pull away. Together, they watched the world wake. Neither spoke of love again that morning. They didn't need to. It was already there, quiet and strong, written in every look, every breath. When they rode back down toward Dust Creek later that day, the town's rooftops shimmered in the distance. People would talk, of course. They always did. But Clara Mae Hensley didn't flinch at the thought. Not anymore. She had survived the flood. She had found a man who saw her as she truly was. And in his arms, for the first time in her life, she felt weightless. The air after the storm smelled of wet earth and ash. The kind of smell that made a person remember how fragile the world really was. The river had calmed, slinking back into its bed like a beast that had eaten its fill. The land was quiet again, but it wasn't the same. It never was after the water had come. Clara Mae sat on the porch of the small hunting cabin where she and Elias had spent the night. The blanket he had wrapped around her was still damp, and her hair had dried into tangled curls. She watched the valley below where her cabin used to stand. All that was left was a crooked chimney rising from the mud, like a finger pointing to heaven. Elias stepped out behind her, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. His shirt clung to him from the night's work. There was a bruise on his cheek, and mud streaked up his arms, but his eyes were steady. He handed her the cup, then leaned on the railing beside her. "You'll come stay at the ranch," he said quietly, "just till we build again." She looked down into the coffee. The reflection of her face trembled in the surface. "I don't want to be a burden." He turned to her, one brow raised. "You think saving my life with a good meal and keeping my house from turning into a ghost again counts as burden?" She smiled faintly. "I reckon I do." He shook his head, taking a sip. "You're stubborn, Clara Mae." "I've had to be." They stood together in silence for a while, the wind brushing through the wet grass. The world felt washed clean, stripped of every pretense. When they finally rode back to the ranch, the land along the trail was unrecognizable. Fences torn down, cattle scattered. Mud clung to the hooves of the mare, and the wagon ruts were filled with brown water. Clara's heart ached at every ruined field they passed. Elias rode beside her, his hat pulled low. "We'll have to rebuild near the ridge," he said. "Higher ground. Safer next time. There'll always be another storm." He nodded. "Ain't that the truth?" The ranch house stood tall at the top of the hill, weathered but untouched. When they reached it, Elias helped her down from the horse. She wobbled when her feet hit the ground. He caught her again. His hands were warm despite the cold. "Thank you," she murmured. "Don't thank me," he said. "You made it easy to ride through hell." She laughed softly, the sound small and tired. Inside, he led her to the kitchen. The fire in the stove was still glowing faintly, and the smell of smoke hung in the air. She stood by the hearth while he fetched a dry blanket from the back room. "You'll take my room," he said. "It's warmer. I'll sleep by the fire. I won't have you giving up your bed." "I didn't ask permission," he said simply. She looked at him, saw the line of exhaustion on his face, the mud still dried in the edges of his hair. "You need rest too. I'll get it, after you do." When she didn't argue, he nodded, satisfied, and set the blanket across her shoulders. She sat down on the edge of the chair, the heat of the fire crawling back into her bones. For the first time in years, Clara Mae didn't feel alone. That night, the ranch was still, except for the creak of the wind against the shutters. Elias sat on the porch with his rifle resting beside him, not because he expected danger, but because it gave his hands something to do. He couldn't stop thinking about her, how she had looked when the river came for her, standing in the rain with her hair wild and her heart unbroken. He had known fear before, but never like that, not even on the battlefield. Inside, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams. The smell of cedar filled the room. She traced the memory of his voice in her mind, the way he said her name like it was something sacred. Sleep finally came only when she realized she was safe. The next morning, she woke to the sound of hammering. Through the window, she saw Elias in the yard with his ranch hands repairing a broken section of the fence. His shirt was already soaked with sweat, the sun still low in the sky. She got up quietly, tied her hair back, and made her way to the kitchen. The pantry was half empty, but she found enough to start a meal. Bacon, flour, a little cornmeal. The rhythm of cooking steadied her. The sound of sizzling fat, the smell of coffee, these were things she understood. When Elias came in, wiping his forehead with his sleeve, she had already set 2 plates on the table. "You didn't have to," he said, smiling. "I know," she replied the same way she always did. They ate without hurry. The quiet between them was soft now, comfortable. When she poured his coffee, he said, "Some of the men are coming by to help clear the lower fields. I told them to eat here if they need to." "Then I'd best make enough for 10, she said. By midday, the ranch yard was alive with voices. Men laughed, shouted, and worked as Clara moved between the kitchen and porch, handing out plates piled high with beans and biscuits. They thanked her like she was the sun itself. Some of them hadn't had a proper meal in days. Elias watched her from across the yard, hammer in hand. He saw the way she smiled at each man, the ease she carried, the way she made even hard men soften. The sound of her laughter rose above the clatter of tools, and something in his chest ached with quiet happiness. When the men had gone, she came to stand beside him at the fence line. The field stretched wide before them, scarred but shining under the light. "Do you ever think the land forgives us?" she asked. He rested his hand on the post. "For what?" "For trying to hold it still when it wants to move." He thought about that, then said, "Maybe it forgives those who stay and fix what's broken." She nodded. "Then I guess we both have work to do." He looked at her, the wind lifting a strand of hair across her cheek. "You planning to stay?" "I don't see anywhere else worth going." The day slipped by in a slow dance of labor and quiet joy. Clara cleaned the house, humming softly as she swept. Elias mended the roof, glancing down every so often to see her moving through the rooms like she'd always belonged there. By evening, the air cooled, carrying the smell of sage and wood smoke. Clara lit a lamp and set supper on the table. Stew, bread, a pie she'd managed to conjure from what little was left in the pantry. Elias came in just as she was cutting the first slice. He hesitated by the door, almost shy. "You've made this place feel like home again." She turned to him. "You said once it used to. Maybe it still can." They ate together, slow and quiet, watching the fire flicker in the hearth. Outside, the coyotes began their songs, distant and haunting. Afterward, she gathered the dishes, but Elias stopped her with a gentle hand. "Leave them. I'll do it." She tilted her head. "You'll just scrub the shine off my plates." "I'll take that risk." She laughed softly, letting him. It felt good to laugh again. When the chores were done, they stepped outside. The stars had come out, scattered bright over the black sky. The land stretched wide and endless, and the air was cool on their faces. Elias leaned against the railing, gazing up. "You ever think about what comes next?" Clara folded her arms. "Next? After what? After the storms, after the work, after all of this?" She thought for a moment. "I used to think about it too much. Now I just want to live the days as they come." He nodded slowly. "That's a good way to live." She turned toward him, studying his face in the starlight. "And you? What do you want next?" He hesitated. "I don't rightly know. Used to be I wanted quiet. Then I got it, and it near drove me mad." He looked at her then. "Now I think I'd like company, someone to talk to when the wind gets too loud." Her heart thudded once, strong and sure. "You already got that," she said. He smiled. "I suppose I do." For a long time they stood there, the world spinning slow around them. The night air was full of crickets and the scent of rain lingering on the grass. When the wind picked up, she shivered. Elias took his coat off and draped it over her shoulders. She didn't protest this time. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Always," he replied. The warmth between them was different now, no longer uncertain, no longer borrowed from fear. It was steady, alive, real. Days turned into weeks. The valley dried, the river retreated, and new grass began to push through the mud. The town of Dust Creek whispered, of course. It always did. People said Clara Mae had moved into Elias Grant's house. They said it wasn't proper. They said she had bewitched him with her cooking. But when she walked through town beside him, basket in hand, no one dared speak those words aloud. Elias walked with his head high, one hand resting gently on hers. Clara didn't hide anymore. She didn't shrink from the stairs. At the church one Sunday, Mrs. Play approached her after service, lips pressed tight in a polite smile. "Miss Hensley," she said, "it's been something, seeing you at Mr. Grant's place. Folks do talk, you know." Clara met her gaze evenly. "They always will," Mrs. Clay faltered. "Well, I hope you know what you're doing." "I do," Clara said. "I'm living." She walked away before the woman could answer. Elias was waiting by the wagon, his hat in hand. When she reached him, he asked quietly, "All right?" "Perfectly," she said, and meant it. That afternoon, they rode home together. The road shimmered in the heat, and the land stretched golden ahead. Clara's laughter carried on the breeze. Elias looked at her, a smile tugging at his lips. "You know," he said, "you've got a way of making even hard days feel easy." She looked at him, eyes bright. "Maybe it's not the days that change, Elias. Maybe it's us." He thought about that for a long moment, then nodded. Maybe it is. When they reached the ranch, the horizon was painted with the colors of sunset, deep gold, rose, and violet. The field swayed with new life. Elias helped her down, keeping her hand in his. They walked toward the porch together, their steps matching without thought. Clara stopped halfway up the steps, turning to look back at the land. "It's beautiful," she said. He followed her gaze. "It is." She took a deep breath, her eyes shining. "Feels like home." He squeezed her hand gently. "That's because it is." She looked up at him, the last light of day catching her face, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel too much of anything. Not too big, not too plain, not too heavy for grace. She felt exactly right. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. The sky above them deepened into twilight, and the first stars began to appear. They stood there together as the night gathered, the quiet between them no longer empty but full of everything that had been missing. The ranch lights glowed warm through the windows. Inside, the table waited for supper. The air carried the scent of fresh bread, and for the first time in many years, both hearts had found where they belonged. In the wide, untamed silence of Dust Creek, love didn't arrive on a white horse. It came on muddy boots, through storms and whispered doubts, and settled quietly between two lonely hearts who learned that home isn't built from timber or stone, but from the warmth of someone who sees you as enough. Clara Mae and Elias Grant proved that even in the harshest frontier, tenderness can take root and bloom like wildflowers after the rain. If you enjoyed this heartwarming tale of courage, second chances, and love on the frontier, don't forget to subscribe to the Wild West Love Chronicles channel, where every story rides through dusty trails, timeless romance, and the kind of love that never fades with the setting sun. Saddle up and join us, so you don't miss the next story that'll steal your heart.